Ladies and gentlemen, welcome again to another edition of the Africa Governance Voices. This is an initiative of the African Peer Review Continental Secretariat, where we've taken things into our own hands and now we are democratizing communication, making sure that African voices are heard. Today's edition, we're talking all things G20, South-South, and we are blessed and very happy to welcome the CEO of the South African Institute of International Relations, otherwise known as SAIIA. This is Madam Elizabeth Sidiropoulos. Elizabeth, welcome.
That's great to be with you, Lennon.
It's an honor. You're the second CEO to actually join us.
And a female CEO.
Yes, so it looks like our gender mainstreaming is even being showcased even with our podcast.
Excellent.
Yes. Elizabeth, please, just for the sake of our audience, we just want to know the basics. What is the G20 and why is it important for Africans?
So the G20 stands for the Group of 20. When it was first established in 1999, it came in the wake of the Asian financial crisis, where a group of finance ministers came together because they had recognized that the old G7, which was the seven most industrialized countries, on their own could not manage a financial crisis, that the world had changed significantly, that there were new kids on the block, and these kids had to be brought into the group. And so it became a G20 finance ministers meeting in 1999, and really focusing on coordinating around global financial and economic stability and related balance of payments, challenges and issues of debt and financial regulation and so on. With the next financial crisis in 2008, which, as we know, actually started in the US and in Europe, the decision was taken, was actually the initiative of the US president at the time to elevate it to a summit meeting. And ever since 2008, the G20 has not only had the finance ministers, but it's also had the leaders of government and of state meeting. And in that process, its agenda also expanded, so that not only do you now have a finance track, which is probably the original G20 from 1999, but you also have a Sherpa track, which and the Sherpa is the representative of the head of state, and the Sherpa track tackles a range of other issues such as digital economy, climate, anti-corruption, agriculture, and so on. And why it's important is because while we have the formal multilateral institutions, which we know have become a little bit more difficult to, where the dynamics in those formal multilateral institutions have become a little bit more complicated in the last few years. The idea behind the G20 is you bring together 20 countries that are systemically important, that if they coordinate can make a difference particularly on global economic governance, and they can help to push consensus also in the formal multilateral bodies, because the formal multilateral bodies should not be replaced by a much smaller group. And that's certainly the position that South Africa and other global South countries take by being members of the G20.
Now, what's the significance of South Africa being the chair this year, and given the fact that Brazil was also chairing before, and now that both South Africa and Brazil are also members of the BRICS, what does this do to the G20 and multilateralism, given the geopolitics of what's going on with, for example, the United States sort of not giving confidence to multilateralism, with President Trump saying he might not even attend the G20 here in South Africa? What is the significance of South Africa chairing now?
So I think there are two issues here that I think are important to address in terms of how you've positioned the thing. The first is, why is it important that South Africa is chairing? And the second is, what is the role of organizations or groupings? They're informal groupings. They're not formal groupings. Informal groupings like the G20 in the current geopolitical environment. On the first question, or the first issue, why is it important for South Africa? Because so firstly, it's the first time an African country has chaired the G20. Of course, South Africa is the only only country from the continent. Obviously, the African Union is now a member. It joined at the invitation in 2023 during the Indian presidency, but it's a body, it's an organization as opposed to a country. So South Africa remains the only African country.
Yes.
And of course, the chairmanship rotates every year. And therefore, there's also no permanent secretariat for the G20. The secretariat every year is the hosting country. What that creates every year for each country that hosts is the opportunity to put things on the agenda of the G20 that are important to the country that is chairing. And so you've seen in the priorities that South Africa has identified a very strong developing country and also African focus. The priorities around, for example, energy and the just transition, very much about the challenges that African countries face, not only to decarbonize, but also to bring 600 million people, to provide energy access to 600 million people. So we're not talking about just decarbonizing, we also have to provide energy. Yes. The other priority has been issues around critical minerals. This has risen in the global agenda, not least in the last 3 months.
That's correct.
But we have seen it as South Africa and Africa as a way of moving ourselves up the value chain. So we have these critical minerals but many of which are also essential for a green transition. Not all, but many are essential for a green transition. We don't want to be replicating the models of the past where we simply extract and export. We want to create industries around that can feed into these new sectors that are being developed in particularly green industrialization. And so South Africa has put green industrialization onto the agenda. The other big issue for Africa is, of course, debt.
Yes.
Debt has been on the agenda of the G20 certainly since COVID, since 2020, and there was the debt suspension initiative, debt service suspension initiative, and then there was the common framework. We know that the common framework has not been working very well. It took Zambia 3 or so years to get an agreement. South Africa certainly is very mindful of the context, the global context, that might make it difficult to do something that's radical, but it also is very aware of the fact that something has to change. And certainly at the very least, the one thing that could change is to bring middle-income countries that are dealing with debt issues into the common framework. Then just to answer your other question, which is around the role of groupings such as the G20 in the current geopolitical context, I think actually organizations such as the G20 are much more important now than perhaps they might have even been 20 years ago. Why? Because they bring together countries from the global north and the global south. They bring together developed and developing from across the world. Okay. BRICS is largely a global south grouping. That's also an informal grouping. There's obviously no formal secretariat. Because of the way in which multilateralism is fragmenting, countries are looking for new groupings that could be very specific or that could be very general to advance some of their interests. Okay. But it's also important to bring competing groupings together. Because at the end of the day, you're not going to negotiate with your friend. You're going to negotiate with your competitor, with your rival, your opponent. If you're talking about reform of the UN Security Council, which is not on the table, I mean, it's not practically.
Why is it not on the table when the African Union is actually there? Wow.
Not practically. It's not we know that it's practically not possible at this point. And it's not just about the US. It's about the US, it's about Russia, and it's about China, if we're going to call them out. I mean, I think the Britain and France have certainly been more open to reform of the Security Council. I've now lost my train of thought. Sorry, guys.
Don't worry. So, what do you expect the African Union to, like in its first year participating?
I remember what I wanted to do.
What? Okay.
Repeat your question.
Okay. What do you expect the African Union, given that it's its first year formally participating in the G20, to actually put on the table as South Africa chairs?
So the African Union did participate from last year because it joined in September 2023. So it participated in 24 during the Brazilian presidency. This was its first sort of foray into the G20 space.
Okay.
I think I think there is a process of ramping up.
Okay.
Clearly, a lot of the discussions are very, very technical. There is capacity, there is technical knowledge within the AU. I think some of the challenges relate to, how can all this technical knowledge be in all of the meetings all of the time? So I think there is an issue of human resources, which I think the AU is very aware of and needs to be built up. There's also a particular way of working within the G20, which, as you join as a new member, I think you need to acclimatize to. In terms of the agenda, I think a lot of the issues that South Africa has identified this year, and Brazil last year, sort of if you think of the Global Alliance Against Poverty and Hunger, that was very much a key driver, a key priority.
So there's a carryover from some of the Brazil's chairing to South Africa's chairing.
Absolutely, and these are all developing country concerns. If you're talking about fighting poverty, fighting hunger, if you're talking about fighting debt, reducing debt in order to be able to have, to make more contributions from the fiscus to achieving the sustainable development goals, all of those are intertwined. We talk about just transition. You talk about building up productive capacity in African states so that you're able to trade more, with higher value products. All of these, I think, are critically important. And all of these are on the agenda this year. It's important to highlight also that there has been a sort of a developing country, global south trajectory of development issues, starting with Indonesia, that chaired the G20 in 2022. It was followed by India in 2023, Brazil last year, and South Africa this year. So there's 4 global south presidencies. Each one has built on the legacy of the previous one, really emphasizing issues of development. And also thinking about global financial issues, which are very much at the core of the G20, through a development prism. And let me just give you an example, and this is very important for the AU, for the
African Union.
Is this year in the development working group that South Africa chairs, which is in the Sherpa track, one of the priorities is on illicit financial flows. Yes. Now, this is not a new item on the agenda. South Africa and others had put it onto the agenda a few years ago. There had been some progress. Then that kind of stopped. We're now reintroducing it. That is something that's really core to Africa's ability to mobilize all of its resources to be able to achieve
self-finance.
And if you've got around 90 billion US dollars that leave the continent every year because of illicit financial flows, at the same time you have a reduction in aid to Africa. You need to build up your tax base. The IFFs clearly are one way through which you can address some of your development finance challenges around, and a lot of it is around regulation and certain technical points that you want to be able to drive forward.
Now, Elizabeth, for South Africans and Africans that are excited and waiting and that are actually following the G20, what are some of the key programs and activities that will take place in South Africa, and some that might be on the continent? What should we anticipate this year?
So the G20 has really grown in terms of its activities. It's a whole of the year set of meetings.
Okay.
As I said, there is the finance track, under which there are a number of task forces which look at specific issues on finance. There is also the Sherpa track, under which there are a number of working groups. And so, in fact, it's a whole of government engagement. You've got your Ministry of Environmental Affairs, your Ministry of Energy, your Ministry of Digital Communications, your Agriculture, your Trade and Industry, obviously your Foreign Affairs, so your Health Department and so on.
Great.
And so you have those, and they are meeting over the course of the year several times. So if I look specifically at the Development Working Group, where my institute has been as part of the Secretariat and one of the resource partners, we have just come out of the second meeting of the Development Working Group. We are preparing for the third meeting in May, and then the ministerial meeting in July, where there will be an outcome document. That outcome document in turn will feed into the summit, which is at the end of the year in November in Johannesburg. So there are, throughout the year,
there's build-ups.
Yeah, there is a build-up. So you start off, you present your priorities. Many of these were presented in December or early January. You have input from all the members. There are also guests who participate. South Africa has invited a number of African countries, as well as...
Wow, which countries have been invited?
So it depends on the working group. But as Egypt, Angola, Nigeria, obviously the African...
So South Africa is carrying other African countries along as it participates in the G20.
And then that's just an important point to make. The AUC obviously drives a lot of the discussions and is in many of the meetings. But of course, it is together with the chair at any one time of the AU, so the rotating chair of the AU. And so what we need to be doing, to be focusing on, if we want to build up Africa's, the AU's participation and agenda setting ability on the G20, is really not just to focus on the African Union Commission, but also on the member states. So there needs to be, we need to build up more effective engagement on the technical dimensions of the G20 across the regions of the continent.
Now, I must congratulate you and your team at SAIIA for the great work. I mean, most of the work that I've read lately has been coming from my institution, and I was recently informed of the T20. As well as the Youth 20. So I'm seeing great initiatives that are coming from SAIIA. Tell us more about the T20. What do you mean T20? What's T20?
So T20 or Think 20 is one of the let's call them civil society or platforms on G20 issues. And so you asked me earlier, what is the calendar for the year? I've given you the calendar for the official track. There are 10 or 12 engagement groups that have been involved and have been established over many years now that focus on specific aspects of the G20. Now, the T20 is a Think 20. It brings together think tanks from really around the world. It's not just think tanks who are in the G20 countries. Because we have an open call for proposals, for policy briefings and so on. The idea there is for the Think 20 to be almost the ideas bank of the G20. For example, this year, SAIIA is one of the co-organizers of the South African Think 20. We have established, together with our other two partners, 5 task forces that mirror or reflect many of the priorities that are on the agenda. So there is a task force on climate and just transitions, under which we also include critical minerals. There is a task force on international financial architecture, under which we also have debt as well as reform of the IMF, World Bank, multilateral development banks. We have a task force on SDGs, solidarity with the FDGs, and there we've put food security as one of the pillars because it's also one of the priorities that South Africa has identified. There's a high-level task force on food security. We have a task force on digital economy.
Oh wow, that would be very interesting. That would be that would be very interesting for a lot of our viewers, the young people. It actually leads me to ask you a question on. Now I'm an ordinary African in the streets. On the news, I'm hearing G20. I'm here in Johannesburg or I'm in Durban. How am I going to benefit from this?
So yes, I mean that's a very it's a very relevant question because sometimes the discussions seem a little rarefied,
very high level.
But if I take one example, if I take, so firstly, there is the possibility if you're a youth or you're involved in civil society or you're involved in labor or whatever, there are the engagement groups create an opportunity for involvement.
Okay.
But obviously you have to be in those particular sectors to be involved. There's also Business 20.
Yeah. Just a shout out to young people. I think there's a Youth 20. I don't know if the applications are still open. I like that dimension that there's a Youth 20, there's a T20.
There's a Civil 20.
Oh, there's a Civil 20.
There's a Civil 20 as well. So if you go onto the website, and I'll come back to your question, which you might have to repeat.
Okay.
But there is a website, the G20.org, which is a South African. So if people just put in to the search South Africa G20, the G20 website.
Okay.
And that website has, apart from the material that is for the official track, they also have links to the all the engagement groups, and they'll be able to see them there. Okay. So on Youth 20 and etc. But you asked them.
No, my question was really ordinary people.
Ordinary people, right?
Yeah, I'm in the streets. I'm seeing billboards that are saying G20. What is it for me?
Yeah.
Like, what does it mean?
So the fact of the matter is that if you're taking, let's take social protection.
Okay.
Now, social protection is a priority that the South Africans have put on the agenda for the Development Working Group.
Okay.
Now, social protection is something that we recognize, particularly after COVID, but not only, as really something that all countries need to be in a position to provide for their citizens.
Yes.
And we know that if we look at the figures, the amount of support that was given to citizens during the pandemic, citizens in advanced economies, was much, much greater because they have much more fiscal capacity, much more money, fiscal space than what was given in developing countries. And we in South Africa ourselves did quite a bit to assist in that regard, although, you know, if 350 Rand is really, but it makes a hell of a difference. Yeah. So what we've put onto the agenda in the Development Working Group is social protection. We're trying to get all of the member states, together with the participation of the guest countries, to agree to a set of principles and priorities.
Oh, wow.
That as G20, but not just, we can lead the way in coordinating on adopting universal social protection coverage.
Wow, this is very important.
And it includes also reflecting on, say, the care economy. So it's not just about, you know, are you getting an old age pension?
Right.
Or are you getting a sort of, do you have unemployment insurance or whatever? It's much broader than that. And part of that is also about sort of adequate access, for example, to food and nutrition and things like that. Now, you may not, as an ordinary citizen, see that immediately.
Okay.
But it is about bringing countries together to agree, at least at the high level, on a set of principles, say around socioeconomic development, which you can then also, as active members of your society, actually call these countries to account. So if you have agreed to X, Y, and Z regarding social protection in the ministerial outcome document, okay, you have to go back home and you should be working towards applying those. Doesn't always work because the G20's decisions are not, they're voluntary. I mean, you know, they're not compulsory. It's you know, we work on consensus. But it creates opportunities for those societies then also to take these forward. And if these countries then take the decisions and actually implement them, then there is a very real benefit for ordinary people on the street, and the same for debt. Because if countries can be forgiven or can have longer repayment frameworks for their debt, it means they have more money to allocate for education and health and so on.
Now, Elizabeth, I want to thank you so much for coming to this table, having a coffee with us at Africa Governance Voices podcast. It's very important that you're here, and we thank you so much for taking your time. Give us a parting shot, especially when it comes to democratization of communication that you're doing. What do you wish for us? We're still in our early phases. What do you wish for us? Who do you want to see on this table, and etc.? Yes.
Well, I mean, I think it is what you guys are doing is really a reflection of the possibilities that have been created around podcasting over the last several years, which means that you no longer have to rely only on the sort of the mainstream media. Although I think sometimes the mainstream media comes in for a lot of flack, and it's not always appropriate, and I think it's not always warranted. Because they have a role to play, whether it's in broadcasting or the print media. I think the traditional, many of them still retain the core principles of journalism, say. But the opportunity to have podcasting and to be able to broadcast it on the World Wide Web, on the streaming, creates the opportunity for you to reach out to people that you wouldn't ordinarily have reached out to. And we know, for particularly the younger generations, podcasts are what they do. I mean, I'm going to sort of show my age here, but when I was growing up, it was the radio. And then the TV came, so how old I am. Sure. But the radio was a primary means of communication. And even until very recently, even probably until about 20, 30 years ago, if you think around many parts of the continent, radio was still the most powerful medium for communication, because people didn't necessarily, if you're talking about accessing rural areas, etc. As we have become more digital, and as we're able to roll out more digital infrastructure across the continent, the ability to communicate through all of these new channels, and everybody now has a smartphone, increases. And that really creates absolutely greater opportunity to get messages out there that might not traditionally have made it through sort of newspapers or sort of CNN or SABC or whatever, because they have, it's also restricted. How much you can do is restricted, whereas with this, it's not restricted. It is indeed democratizing.
Okay. We are having a conversation. Again, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for tuning in. We're speaking all things G20. Looking forward to hear your feedback, your comments, what you also expect from this G20 sort of chairing that is going to be done by South Africa. What are your key priorities that might not be on the table? Thank you.
It's really been great to be hosted here by Lennon, my friend, on the African Governance Voices podcast. And I would really urge all of you to subscribe, like, and whatever else one does on these streaming platforms, because I think they're really developing some really interesting content on all issues related to African governance and Africa's role in the world, in a changing multilateral system.